Father Sean Doggett is a distinguished member of the St. Patrick's Missionaries. He has worked in Nigeria, Kenya, and now Grenada. In the year 2023, he granted me an interview for Spmsmedia. He begins with his childhood back in Dublin, Ireland.
Well, I grew up in Dublin, in the city of Dublin in Ireland, a working class family, very staunchly faithful Catholic family, and brought up, made First Holy Communion with the Dominican sisters, and then attended school with the Irish Christian Brothers at Colostumwira. So all my education, primary and secondary, was through the medium of Irish, that's the tradition in which I grew up. But as children, especially during Lent, we would try to attend Mass every day, every morning before going to school. We'd go to Mass in the local church as far as possible. And most evenings I remember kneeling to say the family rosary. So that's the childhood. During the summer holidays, I used to spend most of my summer holidays with my uncle and aunt and their family, their son and daughter, my cousin, in the country. And that was wonderful, roaming through the fields and minding the animal, taking care of the cattle and feeding the calves and that kind of thing. So I had a very happy childhood, I must say.
Could you tell us a bit about the schools you attended, if you don't mind, leading up to Kiltegan?
Well, really, it was one school, the Irish Christian Brothers, Colostumwira, it was called, in other words, Mary's College, located right in the centre of Dublin. And I took the bus to school until I was old enough to cycle across the city every day into the city. And the Irish Christian Brothers, they were tough disciplinarians, but we did all the usual subjects, and I was not a brilliant student by any means. I suppose I was average, but I managed anyway to finish secondary school, and then I joined St. Patrick's Missionary Society, went to Kiltegan, after my leaving certificate, as we called it then, finish at the end of secondary school.
How did Sean get to know about the St. Patrick's Missionaries?
Oh, well, I discovered Kiltegan because a kind of, I'm not too sure if he was actually a cousin, but a sort of a distant cousin friend from my mother's side of the family was a student there. His name was Sean Casey. He died very tragically in a Fikpo in Nigeria very shortly after he went there, after his ordination. But he would visit us. He was from the country, and when he came to Dublin, he would visit our house and stay with us. And so that's how I got to know Kiltegan. And then I'm not too sure. There were other priests from the society that visited our house. Father Ned McGilligan was another visitor to our house, and Father Mossy Gallagher. I came to know these men and to love to listen to their stories about, it was all Nigeria in those days, of course. And I always felt that's the kind of life I wanted to have. I visualized myself as more or less following in their footsteps and seeing myself as a priest. That just struck me as something worthwhile to do. Those early years, it wasn't easy. First of all, we had to go for medical exam, and that was kind of the first time I actually ever went to Kiltegan. So I followed the instructions and got the bus from Dublin City down to Kiltegan village, and was met there by Father Liam McSorley. And there were a few others also on the bus, but I didn't even know they were going to the same place I was going to. So he met us anyway at the village and drove us up to the college, and we had a supper there. And I remember it was big, thick slices of ham, and I think it was probably homemade brown bread. And I thought, well, at least the food is hearty and wholesome and good to eat. And that was a good sign. That was a favorable impression. In October of that year, then in late September of that year, 1958, we joined. There were 41 of us turned up to start the probation year, the probo year as we called it. And that was that was not easy. First of all, we had to get our black soutanes and our Roman collars and our black berettas for our head. And every student had what was called a Liber Usualis. That was a big book with all the chants of the Mass and the office in it. And so as 17, 18-year-olds, we were dressed up like this on formal occasions, for big liturgical occasions like Sunday or special days like the 2nd of February. But it was kind of tough. In the month of October, we had the 30 days retreat, which was very difficult. Long hours of on your knees in the chapel praying and visits to the director and no talking. That was a real test. But I think all of us except one. I think one didn't come through it. One didn't last. But the rest of us, 41 of us in that class, I think 40 of us survived the 30 days retreat. And then for the rest of that year, it was a lot of manual work and class, getting to know about the society and the work, and also the basics of the faith. And that feeling a sense of identity with the society and having talks from returned missionaries. And that was the first year. And of course, at the end of that academic year, then we got ready to move to Cork for philosophy. And I was kind of surprised to see my name up to go to the university and do the degree course, because I wasn't all that brilliant academically, but I was very, very happy. And I tried my best and gave it my best. And eventually I did get a BA degree from Cork. But I must say I enjoyed those years very, very much. And then came back to Kiltegan for theology, and that was more serious now. Vin McNamara was our rector, Father Vin, and he, at that time, there was great development. The Second Vatican Council was on, and there was a lot of excitement about all this newness in theology, this new theology and the emphasis on the Bible and scriptural studies. A lot of excitement and a lot of newness there. So it was new, and it was very challenging to the old kind of conventional ideas that we had as children of the church being, keep the laws and believe doctrines of faith, and if you don't believe it, it's anathema. Moving from that attitude to trying to study the Word of God and trying to discern the will of God, that was an exciting time. So those years of theology, again, time of change and development and excitement.
All right. Now, do you remember much, leading up the days leading up to your ordination? But before then,
yes.
But before then, Sean, would you like mentioning one or two of your, let's say, favorite lecturers, in either philosophy or theology that you always remember?
Well, in philosophy in Cork, we had Professor Charlie O'Connell for geography, and we had the famous Professor Mrs. B.G. McCarthy for English, and Professor McCarthy kind of soared to the heights of literature and raised our standards of English way above what we were used to and what we had got from secondary school. And Professor Charlie O'Connell, he opened our eyes to the world around us, and I remember introducing us to the subject of geomorphology. In other words, look at the hills and the landscape round about and the coast and see what has been happening over eons of time, how the earth has been changing and developing. And of course, all of that now is bearing fruit as we emphasize global warming and the ecology and the document of Pope Francis, the exhortation Laudato Si, and awareness of the environment all around us. So that was something. In philosophy then, I must say I wasn't very much of a philosopher, but the famous Father James was there. And I didn't have him very much because he was sick for a lot of the time. But I'm afraid I was no great scholar of philosophy. But anyway, I managed to struggle through. How, I really don't know, but Cork was a good experience. Philosophy was a good experience, yes. Well, yes, well, Vin McNamara, of course, was the outstanding man teaching us theology and especially moral theology. And the whole approach, like the whole new approach to theology, getting away from the mentality of what is a mortal sin? How far can you go without committing a mortal sin? This was the kind of attitude we had as teenagers growing up. But he opened our minds to the whole concept of love the Lord your God with all your heart, and that the law is not there to tie you down, but the law, you know, that the moral law of the church is meant to bring freedom and maturity and to enhance relationships, that it's not just a set of regulations which must be followed literally, but it's the law of Christ, and especially the new law of love, is a way of life. It's a different way of living. And so that was a big influence on me, and I think on all of us who were his students at that time. The ordination, the leading up to it, a lot of excitement, a lot of preparation. As I said, we had all that hard work laying out the grounds and doing the lawns there in the compound. But there was a lot of other things too. During those years of theology, that building had just been completed, and maybe the previous year or 2 years before I came from Cork, we had the first real winter storm. And I remember the night of the storm, the wind was so strong that even though the window was closed, the curtains were flapping and blowing. And I remember getting out every blanket and every bit of clothing I had to put on to try to keep warm. Because even though the central heating was working, it seemed to have no effect against the dreadful cold that was blowing. And another year, I remember, the snow was so heavy that the bus from Dublin, the paddy, the farm manager, had to take the tractor and trailer down to meet the bus and take our suitcases on the trailer, and we had to plod through the snow up to the college, through about a foot of snow. And I think that night was so cold that we felt that wind. But that passed and we got over it. But then there was another time we were settled in to the college, but we were still having food down in the old refectory, which is the basement of what is now the middle house. And this storm was so severe, this must have been, I don't know if it was the same year or another year, that the electricity was off. There was no electricity all over the countryside, all over that area. The electricity was off. But because we were actually living in the college, the only part that was just about complete was the kitchen and dining room. And they had installed this big cooker, this big solid fuel cooker to do the cooking. But they couldn't get it to light. They couldn't light it without a little electric fan. So they still couldn't use that for cooking. So we had to go back down to the basement of the middle house for our meals. But the meals consisted, we would go in relays. The meals consisted of potatoes, just potatoes, because they couldn't get in meat or the other supplies from the villages round about it. So every day we were going down in relays, class by class, for dinner of boiled potatoes. Now that went on for a few days, and meanwhile, to pump water had to be pumped from the well up to the tank in the top of the tower to supply water to the toilets and to the rooms in the college. So there were teams of students lined up throughout the day, from morning until evening, pumping this pump by hand in relays to keep the water flowing, pumping up to the tank on top of the tower so that we had water to flush the toilets and water in the wash basins and the showers. Those were tough days, but I must say, in spite of everything, like, we look back on it with a sense of pride, and and even, yes, a sense of pride and even joy.
That's amazing.
So the ordination, yes, the ceremony was in Killamote Church, and it was Easter Sunday, 1966, and our visitors, of course, my visitors, family members, had come down from Dublin, and it was a very moving ceremony. I remember being prostrate when we were all lying down on the ground and just thinking about, what am I really getting myself in for? Am I really ready for this? And just saying, well, I'll give it my best. That's all I can do. And then afterwards, of course, dressed up in our new soutane with the cape on top over the shoulders, and giving the first blessing to family members and priests and all kinds of people, and so feeling very happy and very proud as a newly ordained priest. So that's my memory of ordination.
Do you remember the bishop? The bishop who ordained you?
The bishop was Bishop Rogers. He was the uncle of Father Jack Rogers and Michael Rogers. He was the bishop of Killaloe, I think, at the time. As far as I remember, he was the bishop.
I see. Thanks very much, Sean. Sean, tell me, the first countries you worked in, pre-Grenada,
yes.
Could you tell us a bit about them, one by one, briefly?
Sure, yes. My first appointment was to the Diocese of Ikotek in Nigeria. And I remember the night before I left Dublin to go to Nigeria, I remember my mother preparing a meal of bacon and eggs and sausages and black pudding. And I thought, now, I won't see this now. I think it was for 3 years at least, was the first tour in those days. I said, now, I won't see this now for another 3 years. I didn't expect to get that in Africa, in Nigeria. So took the flight and arrived in Nigeria. I think it was early October, about the 5th or 6th of October, 1966. And when the flight landed at Kano Airport, as it used to do in those days, there was a great air of tension. And I remember we had to get off the plane and went in for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the restaurant. And I remember Father John Coonahan, who was with me, he remarking on the tension that there was around. The waiters wouldn't talk and they were looking furtively at each other. And that was just, I think the very next day, the killings began in northern Nigeria, the killing of Easterners, especially Igbos. And I think the very next day, a lot of the workers at the airport actually stormed the flight and got onto that BOAC flight to come down to Lagos, and because the killing had started, and that was the start really of the trouble in between Biafra and Nigeria in those days. But I arrived in Ikotek and was teaching in the junior seminary there. And I remember I had no experience of teaching, but I remember trying to teach English in Form 1 and trying to get the kids to pronounce, the boys to pronounce English properly. And it was an experience. But unfortunately then, the eastern region seceded as the Republic of Biafra, and then the blockade started, and then the terrible shortages of everything, and then the bombing and the fighting, and the school had to close. And for months in the beginning, we tried to go out to the villages where some of our students were and give impromptu classes in the villages. But that couldn't continue either for very long because of the war. And that was 1966. I think it was 67, January 68. We used to you couldn't get messages. There was no phone, there was no mail, and there was no phones. But we used to get messages from Ireland over Radio Brazzaville. And a message came over Radio Brazzaville that my father was dying and that I should come home if I could find any means of getting back to Ireland. So with the help of various brothers, especially John Lawler and some of our brothers in Port Harcourt, the Spiriting Fathers, I managed to get on one of the arms flights from Port Harcourt at night, illegal flights of course, to the island of San Thome. and from there to Lisbon, and Lisbon on to Dublin. And that was quite an adventure. That really was something. Flying on this super Constellation, this old piston-engined aeroplane with no seats. It was a cargo plane from, I don't know how many hours it was, but it was a long, long flight from São Tomé, and it had to fly around West Africa so as not to fly over Nigeria to reach Portugal, to reach Lisbon. And from there, I had to try to get a flight to Dublin, but of course I had no money and no ticket. But eventually, the Pan American Airways office there, the guy there helped me. He phoned Dublin, at least, my sister was able to pay for the fare in Dublin, and he issued me a ticket in Lisbon to fly home to Dublin. So that was quite an adventure. So I spent just about a year. My father died, and I was there for just about a year. But I really wanted to get back to Nigeria, because I knew that by that stage the Federal Army had advanced through from Calabar up to Ikotekpeni, but Urakpan and Midham and Urakpan and oh gosh, I can't even remember the names of about 2 other parishes were still on the Biafran side. And I knew that Gus Frawley and Tony Cronin and some of our guys were there, and they had been there a long time and were long overdue leave. And I really wanted to go out and replace them. And eventually I did get to go back out on a relief flight. And I flew into Uli Airport and made my way down to Ikotekpeni, where eventually I relieved Tony Cronin and Gus Frawley. So I was there in Ikotekpeni, in Urakpan, for that would have been from, I remember I had arrived shortly before the man landed the first moon landing, and I remember listening to that on the radio on BBC on shortwave. And that would have been April 1969, if I'm not mistaken. And of course the war was on, and it was quite well, adventurous really. I mean, when you're young, it's all part of an adventure. But the starvation and the hunger, my main work that time was in the distribution of relief and working with the refugees, and still trying to say mass, because the compound in Urakpan was absolutely jam-packed with thousands of refugees. The school and then the hospital had been evacuated, so all the equipment had been moved out, but some of the doctors and nurses who were refugees themselves, they had moved in and they were trying to use it as a hospital for the refugees. But eventually, of course, the day came when the Federal Army moved forward and we had to pull out. And Father Porrick Hanley at that stage, he was back, and Father Isidore Umana and myself, we ended up in, Ututu, Aruchuku. And we were there for some weeks until eventually the Federal Army moved forward, and that was the end. Biafra collapsed. That was January 1970. So we were taken, Porrick Hanley and myself were taken to meet General Olusegun Obasanjo, who was the commander, who was the divisional commander at that time. And he gave us permission to remain in his area of command for a month. So we stayed there for a month until eventually a special branch officer came looking for us, and we were taken down to Calabar, and we spent a few days in Calabar police station before being taken to Lagos, and eventually escorted to the airport by a special branch officer and put on a flight for, I think I went to Rome. And that was the end of my missionary experience in Nigeria. So after a short holiday then, I was appointed to Kenya, to the Diocese of Kitui, and I spent 11 years there. So that was my first appointment in Nigeria, and my second appointment, Kitui in Kenya.
Any special highlights of Kitui that was?
Yeah, my first 4 years in Kitui, I was principal of a little Harambe school in a place called Muthale. And it was a mixed school initially, and we were trying to build it up. It wasn't easy. The local committee, we had a good local committee there, and eventually we got a few little buildings up, and eventually the Franciscan missionaries took it over as a girls' school and as a boarding school for girls. And I managed to visit back there in, I think it was 2014, was it? For an ELM meeting in Kenya. And I went back to visit Kitui. And I visited Mudale School. It had grown enormously, huge multi-story buildings covering the little compound. But outside the principal's office, there was a list of previous principals. And first on the list was Sister S.R. Docket. Sister Doggett. So I presume that was me.
That's amazing. Sorry.
Anyway, after 4 years there, I was appointed to the parish of Miambani, which was, very, very nice. It was a lot of some of the stations, some of the outstations, you could only reach it on motorbike. You could reach part of the way on motorbike and part of the way on foot. But that I was there for a few years and I enjoyed that. And then I was appointed to the pastoral center in Kitui. And that was a major challenge, but the whole idea, pastoral centers were just becoming popular there. There were a number of them had already been started, Kitale and some other places. And so, trying to determine what exactly we needed and what was the purpose of it and what we could use it for, that was an exercise, that was an education in itself. And eventually, of course, we got the buildings up and it began to be used, and it really was a center. It was called Vomewa Christo, in other words, the meeting place for Christians. And we had a lot of workshops, meetings, diocesan pastoral council meetings, training workshops of various kinds there, including the Delta program, Sally and Anne, and that was one of the centers where we had a lot of these diocesan and interdiocesan Delta workshops. So there was a lot of excitement. Things were moving, things were changing. The church was changing, society was changing. We were moving from a church where the priest was everything, where it was the priest's church, and where the priest got funding from overseas and the priest started a project. It was the priest's water project. Moving from that to the power of the people and working with teams. And I remember Sally and Anne made it a rule. The priest could not come alone to a workshop. He had to come with his team from his parish. So this was very challenging. And of course, the whole Delta method, the whole Power of Frere workshop was challenging authority and what's the basis of authority and empowering ordinary people. This was exciting. This was revolutionary in many ways. So there, I spent 11 years there, and before eventually my term was up, I took a sabbatical in 1981, and at the end of that, I was appointed to Grenada.
So you now got appointed to Grenada. Was there any background reason for Grenada to be opened at the time? And what year was this, Sean?
Well, that was 1983. At the end of that sabbatical year, the first Kiltegan, the first society priests had gone to Grenada in 1970. And Grenada became independent in 1973 from an independent country. And in 1979, Grenada had had a Marxist revolution. So after 1979, it wasn't easy to get priests into Grenada. But eventually, anyway, Father Jim Regan and myself were given entry visas permitted to come and work in Grenada. And the Marxist government called the revolution, which we popularly refer to as the Revo, was in power in those days, and there was a lot of tension between the Revo and the church, the revolution and the church. And there were a lot of good things in the Revo and a lot of things that were not so good. So that brought a certain division even in the church. Many of the young people were very favorable to the revolution, and many of the older people were very much against it. So it brought a certain tension within the church. But so the Revo was there from 1970 until 1983. Now, I arrived in February 1983, and that was the situation that I met there. You know, I would have had a lot of, been supportive of much of the things the revolution was doing. And that made me rather unpopular with many senior church people. But in October 1983, the revolution, I have to say, imploded. There was a split in the government, which led to violence, the arrest of the Prime Minister, and eventually the execution of Maurice Bishop, who was the revolutionary Prime Minister, and a number of his colleagues, and violence, shooting in the centre in St. George's, in Fort Rupert, as it was called then, one of the 18th century forts there, which was the headquarters of the army and the police. And that was traumatic for such a small island. Grenada is just like the size of an Irish county, small Irish county, with a population of about 110,000. So this was absolutely the death of these people and the injury of some of the civilians, of the demonstrators who were on the fort and who were around at that time. And that was traumatic in the country. And that was followed then by a few days of a very severe curfew, indoor, nobody allowed out at all. And eventually then the Americans and some of the other Caribbean, the forces from other Caribbean islands invaded and overthrew whatever remnants of the revolution were there, and began more or less direct rule of Grenada. So that was very exciting times, the time of the American invasion and American soldiers all over the place, and the arrest of the revolutionary leaders who had overthrown the Prime Minister, and a lot of tension, a lot of division. You know, civil war and civil division always brings a lot of grief and a lot of division, right even into families. But gradually over time, eventually in 1984, there was a general election. More or less, I could say democracy, if we can call it so. At least the Westminster parliamentary form of democracy was restored. And Grenada began to move forward and to make a lot of progress economically, and things have been good and have been quiet since. So this year in fact, yesterday, we began the beginning to prepare for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Grenada's independence. And last week, or the week before last, the 25th of October, or the 19th of October rather, the week of the 19th to the 25th, came the solemn remembrance of the events which had happened exactly 40 years previously. So all of this is leading towards a kind of a healing process and a retelling of the stories of 40 years ago and 50 years ago, and it's leading to hopefully a healing of the divisions that were caused by the disturbances of 1983 and 1979. So that's the situation here at present, politically.
So, Sean, how would you describe what your missionary work has been? I mean, certainly it has been colored by the situation on the ground. It has been conditioned by it.
Yeah.
Could you briefly tell us, what type of things that you had to do as a missionary in those years?
My missionary work has not changed really throughout. I've been a parish priest, And my main thrust of my time has been spent in parish ministry, pastoral ministry, visiting the sick, preparing for sacraments, working with youth and parish councils and catechists, and that has been, most of my time is taken up by that direct pastoral work within the parish. But 9 of my 40 years, I've been here 40 years now, and 9 of those 40 years I spent on the islands of Carriacou, Petit Martinique. The diocese and the country of Grenada is made up of 3 islands. The main island of Grenada, which is the big island, and then 2 smaller islands, the island of Carriacou, with the population of maybe about between 5 and 10,000. And then the smallest island of Petit Martinique, with a population of maybe 1,000. So for 9 years, my parish was located on the 2 smaller islands of Carriacou and Petit Martinique. And my joy and my happiness and my gladness was that eventually I got my own boat for making the journey across between the 2 islands, a distance of about 2 miles. And that was wonderful. I had a wonderful freedom there, and do a little bit of fishing and go off and visit some of the other islands, Union Island and Mairo. And I must say those years in Carriacou and Petit Martinique were very happy years in my life. Now then of course, eventually in 1996, I was appointed to the cathedral in St. George's. And that was a different situation. That was a very busy city parish, and so a lot of very hard work there. And one of my duties was as one of the Catholic representatives on the Conference of Churches in Grenada. The Conference of Churches in Grenada consisted of the leaders of the Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Salvation Army churches in those days. Other churches have joined since then. And I must say the Conference of Churches played a very leading role in many of the events in the country, particularly in what I would say speaking truth to power. There were times when certain scandals and certain appearances of corruption were there. And as a Conference of Churches, we had the strategy of speaking to those in power, those in authority, and explaining the perception that people had, and entering into dialogue on particular issues that we felt were not in the interests of the country or were in the interests of the country. And that I do believe that was a very, very valuable contribution that the Conference of Churches made to the country. Eventually also, the conference got involved in even in industrial relations, in mediating in certain industrial disputes. And again, I do believe that was a contribution that the conference made. And I must mention, for most of those years, the president, the chairman of the conference was the Presbyterian minister, Dr. Osbert James. And at other times it was the now Anglican bishop, Bishop Leopold Friday. And these were great men, and it was a great joy and a pleasure to work with them. And we had a very, very close personal relationship between us. And so I'm very happy that we did make quite a worthwhile contribution to development and to healing within the country in those days.
Sean recalls the horrible hurricane that hit Grenada in the year 2004 and how the church and St. Patrick's missionaries came to the aid of the people.
We got a new bishop in, what year was it? 2002. 2003, was it? 2003. Bishop Vincent Darius. He was the first Grenadian bishop. And at that time, I had been 7 years in the cathedral, and I decided it was time to take a sabbatical, which I did. But towards the end of my sabbatical year, just before I finished, Grenada was hit by a terrible hurricane, Hurricane Ivan. And about 95% of the buildings on the island of Grenada were either totally destroyed or seriously damaged. When I say seriously damaged, most of them lost their roofs. Churches, schools, private houses, absolutely devastated. So that was a major challenge. And relief, of course, poured in from all quarters, from other islands. Trinidad was magnificent with the help that they gave and the amount of stuff that they sent. The United States, Britain, lots of countries sent in help. And part of my job was to assist with the distribution of relief. And I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish in those early days immediately after the hurricane, in getting stuff out straight from the port or the airport, straight out into the villages, without well, to a large extent, without having to load it on trucks, bring it to a store, load it back on trucks and bring it out to villages, in getting it straight out from where it came, straight out to the most remote villages throughout the island. And also construction materials to try to do immediate repairs to schools and houses and presbyteries. So that was a major challenge after the hurricane. So when that began to settle down a little bit, I was appointed to my present parish, which is Bolio, Our Lady Help of Christians. And I've been there since then, almost, 18 years, I think.
COVID-19, as it did elsewhere, had a massive negative impact on the society in Grenada. Sean remembers those days of the pandemic and how the Church and St. Patrick's missionaries responded to it.
But when COVID came then, Grenada, I must say, did very, very well. And I have to give full credit to the Grenada government, especially the Minister of Health, because he called together the Committee of Social Partners, which consisted of the Conference of Churches and the trade unions and the employers and the NGOs. And I remember it was Tuesday, March the 22nd, 2020. And he had been in some Zoom meeting with other ministers of health. And what he said was, he said, this COVID must be in Grenada now, although we have not yet seen any case. But he said there's no way that it is not here. And he said the United States is in confusion. They have no central plan. They have no central Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health. And it's up to states and even individual companies to do their own thing. And he said they're in confusion. And he said Britain, the United Kingdom, is in denial. Because at that stage they were saying, well, let people catch it and eventually they'll develop herd immunity. And he said, if we don't lock down now, Grenada is going to be decimated. So straight away he got the agreement of everybody to have a very strict lockdown for a number of months. And that happened, and it was observed. And then there were special days when you could do shopping in special places and using the face masks and all the rest of it and keeping distance. And the result was that there were no deaths. There were very, very few deaths in Grenada resulting in COVID. And I think any of the deaths that did occur were mainly due to pre-existing conditions like diabetes and other perhaps lung infections that people had. So there were very, very few deaths directly from COVID within Grenada. But of course, there was a lot of hardship. What we tried to do in this parish, in our parish, with assistance from the society, and the society was very generous to us in assisting with funds for COVID, was to help the neediest families with the most basic items that they needed in the house. And we didn't want, you see, there are supermarkets in the town, and the easy thing to do would be to go to the supermarket and buy things or go to the wholesalers and buy things in bulk. But the local people do their shopping in the local shop. So we decided that we would support the local shops in the villages. So in the communities roundabout, and there are basically 4 communities within the parish, we got one of the local shops or 2 of the local shops to agree that they would accept vouchers from us that we would give to the people. And the list of items was on the voucher. This list that we had worked out, the parish council members had worked out, as the most essential items needed, and that we would pay the prices were agreed with the shopkeeper. And when people went with these vouchers, when they went with these documents, they were given that, and we paid the local shopkeepers directly. And that brought a lot. That helped to keep the money circulating within the villages roundabout. And I believe that's something I feel happy and proud to have been part of. And I'm very grateful to the society for making those funds available.
Sean, still on Grenada, if I asked you, for somebody who doesn't know people from Grenada, how would you describe them generally? What's the spirit of the people of Grenada?
Well, the vast majority of the people of Grenada are of African origin. Grenada was first colonized. Well, it was, I suppose, the first the Aboriginal people of Grenada were Amerindian, Kalinago, Arawak, Caribs, and the first Europeans were Spanish. And Christopher Columbus sighted this island on the 8th of December. I think it was 1498, somewhere there. And he said it reminded him of Granada in Spain. So he christened this island Conception Island. But later then the Spanish began to, the French began to call it Ile de la Grenade, the island of Granada. And that was eventually changed to Grenada. And then the French, during the Napoleonic Wars, Grenada, the island changed hands between the British and the French, and eventually ended up in British hands with the name of Grenada, Grenada, not pronounced Grenada, but Grenada. The French were the first settlers. The first people to come and settle on the land were the French. And they made war on the Caribs and Arawaks, the Aboriginal people. And there is a point, a cliff in the north of Grenada called Le Morne de Sauteurs, the Hill of the Leapers, where the legend has it that the last of the Caribbeans jumped over the cliff into the sea rather than be enslaved by the French, by the Europeans. But of course then people from Africa were brought in and enslaved and forced to work on the estates. The island was divided up into many estates, and the estates then used the labor of the African people who had been brought in as slaves. So that was the situation. You had the estate owners and the estates until the 1940s and the 1950s, and there began to be organization and agitation, and gradually, mainly due to the leadership of the first Prime Minister of Grenada, Eric Gairy, the estates were gradually taken over and divided up, and the land distributed to the people. But the vast majority of Grenadians today are people of African descent. There are also some of Indian descent, because after the abolition of slavery, the estate owners brought in people from India as indentured laborers. And they suffered even worse than a condition even worse than slavery, because at least the estate owners had some legal obligation to see that the enslaved people had food and clothes, but they had no obligation whatsoever to indentured laborers. So many of the Indian people eventually left the estates and squatted high up in the hills, in the mountains. And so even today, if you go into some of the villages high up in the center of the hills of Grenada, you'll find a lot of people showing signs of their Indian origins. Grenada, of course, is a very volcanic island, very hilly and forested with tropical rainforest. Roads are narrow and steep and absolutely covered with tropical rainforest. Very beautiful, very lovely. Now that's the what can I say, the topography and the social makeup of Grenada.
Sean reveals what he misses most whenever he leaves Grenada on holidays.
Well, I miss, of course, the warmth. The weather is always warm. You never need a pullover or a jacket here, although we do wear jackets on very formal occasions. But that freedom of never feeling cold. In fact, to feel cold is a kind of a luxury here sometimes. In January and February, sometimes the temperature does drop a bit, maybe to the high 20s instead of the low 30s. It drops a few degrees, and that's a kind of a relief. But also the beautiful sea. To be able to go to Grenad's beach or one of the beautiful beaches in Grenada and relax, totally relax in the absolutely clear, calm, beautiful, warm Caribbean waters. That's something that I miss, will always miss, and miss very much.
Now, what are Sean's thoughts of the process of internationalization in St. Patrick's Society?
I always strongly supported the idea of internationalization, and I feel very happy. I must say I've had a very limited contact with our younger African members. I've met some of them all right, and I met some at the General Chapter last year. And I've just had Patrick Essicon here with me for 2 months, and we had Darlington here as an FMA student some years ago, and we had Humphrey Rasanga here also during the COVID period. And I see that these young men of African origin can have a huge effect and a huge influence, particularly by being able to adapt to the local culture. Remember, the culture of Grenada is not African. It's, yes, the people are of African origin, but because of the years of history and the history of enslavement, African culture and African values have largely been lost to a large extent. So coming from Africa and bringing something of those African values, and yet being able to understand and appreciate the local history and the local culture, this is a contribution that our younger African members can make. We older, I have to say, European Irish priests, yes, we had something to offer, and we brought what we had, which was that old tradition in the faith. But our younger members bring something new. They bring a more, what can I say, a more lively, a more down to earth, a more practical, earthy, feet on the ground type of faith, which goes a long way, which helps a lot here. And I look forward to the day when we have many society priests of African origin from different African countries. And this is a big advantage, that our members are not all from one African culture or one African country, but from a variety. And there's a huge variety. There's a huge difference, cultural difference between West Africa and East Africa and Central Africa, even within some of the African countries. And it's that variety, that African culture is not just one uniform something, but that ability to adapt and to see different aspects of culture and to adapt to the Caribbean culture. That's a very valuable asset that our younger men can bring. And I would add even something else. The history of the presbyterate of the island and the Diocese of Grenada has not been a happy one. Over the years, going back in history, there was a history of, going way back now to the 1800s, there was always a history of sort of a struggle between church authorities and clergy in Grenada, and between state authorities and clergy, between Anglican and Catholic. That tension was always there. And then in the year 1901, the English province of the Dominican order were given the responsibility for the pastoral administration of the island of Grenada. And they brought a huge contribution, and they built churches, and they did a lot of work in building up the church in Grenada. But then, by the 1950s, their thrust was really spent. And Grenada became an independent diocese, and priests were needed, and priests were brought in from all kinds of places, from America, from England, from Eastern Europe. And there was never really, there were few local priests as well. There was never really a cohesive, there was never really a great, what can I say, a great spirit of community among the clergy. There were always certain differences and tensions and differences of approach and cultural attitudes. But I do believe that our younger African men, because of their formation and because of their background, that they will do a lot towards bringing a kind of esprit de corps, a sort of a community spirit, a better spirit of unity and cooperation among the clergy, all the clergy of the different groupings of clergy within the diocese. And I believe that's a contribution, a very positive contribution that they can make.
Sean speaks about his hopes for the people and the country of Grenada.
Well, I have great hope. I have seen a lot of material progress, economic progress, social progress over the 40 years that I've been here. And I see that continuing. And I mean, when you think of a little place like Grenada with only 100,000 people producing a gold medal prize-winning athlete a medal-winning athlete at the Olympic Games, the World Olympic Games, best in the world, in the 400 meters in the 2012 Olympic Games in London. And when you see the world champion, what do you call it, throwing the javelin, when you see Grenada was also the first to have a revolution. The Grenada was the first to try something different. There's that spirit of give it a go, of try it, of what's the word I want, of punching way beyond its weight. That's the spirit of Grenada, that this little island can punch hard and punch high and do great things. And I look forward to Grenada setting an example. If I can just give another example of this. During the economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2008 to 2012, about 12-13, all the countries went through a serious economic problem, debt crisis, sovereign indebtedness. And I remember the island of Dominica in 2017, when it was very, very severely damaged. Even the infrastructure, not only buildings, but roads and bridges destroyed by a terrible hurricane. That very year, they had to pay millions of US dollars to the International Monetary Fund in repayment of a loan they had received. There was no mercy. Now, Grenada has led the way in renegotiating that kind of thing, in participating in the Jubilee movement worldwide. And we are part now, we are leading in Jubilee Caribbean, in negotiating the terms of international loans and sovereign indebtedness, and what happens when a country when one of the island states, which is least responsible for global warming, is struck by a hurricane, which is the consequence, the severity of a severe hurricane, which is caused, and the frequency and the severity caused by global warming. The unfairness of this, and to bring justice to that, I feel very proud of what Grenada has been able to do internationally in negotiating around those issues.
What are Sean's hopes for St. Patrick's Society in Grenada?
I hope to see a couple of, at least 2 FMA students here next year. I'm hoping for that, and I have asked for that. And I have asked for at least 2 of the newly ordained, those who are to be ordained next year, to be appointed to Grenada, and perhaps 1 or 2 more senior men, either volunteers. You know, we have this long tradition of working with volunteers priests from other dioceses, that many of them would come, because there are a number of parishes here in Grenada without priests. And I see the contribution that these men could make to the growth of the church, to the growth of the synodal church in Grenada. I see huge possibilities there, and I'm full of hope for the future.
So, Sean, this interview is being conducted whilst there is this very painful war between Israel and Palestine. Look, have you anything to say about it, or a prayer to make, or a wish?
Oh, my heart is with the people of Gaza. I mean, it's appalling what they have to suffer. I mean, they're being told to move. Their houses are being destroyed. Even the places to which they are told to move are being bombed. And, you know, everything is running short. My heart goes out to those people, and they have suffered so much for so many decades, for so many years. I really pray that the cruelty in the minds of the leaders, of those who are causing the violence, that would be changed. And I find it amazing that people like the people of Israel, the Jewish people, who have suffered so much themselves, and about whom such terrible things were said in the 1930s in Germany and in Europe, and who have suffered so much condemnation and hatred themselves, how they can have this kind of, how they can perpetuate that against another set of people. This appalls me. And I mean, what can we do? We can only pray for peace and offer whatever support we can to all those who are suffering in this terrible, terrible conflict.
The Synod on Synodality was just taking place at the time of this interview. Sean gives his views about synodality in the church.
I would hope that it's really, I mean, the whole idea of synodality is walking together and listening to each other. And that's the whole point, that we listen to each other and we listen to the people among whom we work. That we're not trying to impose customs and structures and habits and ways of doing things that we grew up with, but that we're listening to people, that we're seeing their hopes and their dreams, we're seeing the reality of their lives, and that this is where the Christian teaching, this is where the Christian values, the values of the Beatitudes, this is where we make those, where we preach those not by words, but by actual example, by walking with people, by talking with people, by working with people. That's my hope for the future. We're going through very difficult days church-wise because attendances are down. People got used to not coming to Mass on Sunday, watching Mass on television. So many people feel there's no necessity to actually go into the church. We can just watch it on television. We can pray at home. That kind of attitude has come in. But the whole idea of synodality, let us come together, let us walk together, let us go together, let us worship together. This listening to each other and listening to the Word of God together, this, I believe, is the way the church will go forward and is going forward.
In the year 2020, Father Sean was recognized for his contribution to religious and community service in Grenada by the late Queen Elizabeth II. He was conferred with the insignia Office of the British Empire, OBE. We thank Sean for granting us this interview on SPMS Media, and we wish him the very best as he continues his missionary work. Joe.Archibong for SPMS Media.